It's good to be with you again this morning. My name's Scott. I'm one of the pastors here at Watershed, and when I begin to ask myself what a better world looks like, I'm not even sure sometimes how to answer that question. I think for me, I have an idea as to what that could look like, but maybe if a world is better for me, it might not be for somebody else. And so constantly trying to live with this sense of, well, a better world is, and then kind of ... And I don't always know how sort of to handle that or what to even do with that at times, because, again, how I'm going to edit it might be different than what you would do or how it impacts your life personally. Here at Watershed, we stand by this statement that Watershed is a community awakening, struggling, and loving together as though a different world is possible today. So for us, the conversation isn't just this long arc of what's happening in the future, but also how is it playing out in the moments in which we live today, in our experiences, in our relationships. And I think that the challenge that I struggle with in my own reality is I might be too conventional at times. I'm a problem solver in kind of the way I work and how I see things often, and so I'll see a situation or a need, and I'll invariably kind of come around that in my own thoughts or with a team of people, whatever it might be, and we fix the problem, or at least that's the attempt that we go after. That's kind of a conventional way, right? You see the issue and you go after the issue. But I'm pretty convinced that Jesus had a different way of doing this. And he asked different questions, and he was not necessarily conventional. Jesus made some huge changes in the world and did them through very different ways and different modes. And so to ask the question, what does a different world look like, maybe I have to remove myself from being the filter and attempt to filter it other ways. And so what I've been doing, at least of late, especially in this series and preparing for it today, been engaging some of the passages in the scriptures that I think that really do a great job of sort of disrupting, at least for me, how I see this sort of conventional way, this here's a problem and now here's a way to fix it kind of approach. And we see in Matthew 13, which is kind of a fun sort of passage to look at, because there's all these parables that are laid out in these verses, and for whatever reason Matthew chose to put them all together. And it's possible that it's also how Jesus spoke all of them. He would just sort of in a staccato fashion gave us all these different parables. And you have these really chunky parables with multiple verses and tons of potential meaning and symbolism and metaphor and cryptic messaging and things that we might not know but we can speculate on. That's the beauty of a parable. You can play with it. It's designed to be danced with in terms of how one might interpret what's the meaning behind it. And so in Matthew 13, you've got all these big parables, but then you've got a couple really small, tiny ones, real pithy ones, sort of peppered in the middle of this passage in this chapter. And if you've been around the church at all, you've heard these, and maybe if you've not been a part of the church, there's a good chance you might have even heard these parables, because they're relatively popular, and they, I think, are loaded with so much insight. And insight may be that if I begin to look at a different world through what Jesus was meaning, or at least attempting to give us in these parables, it might remove this hyper-conventional way, this hyper-practical way in which maybe we look at kingdom, maybe we look at the work that Jesus is inviting us into. So in Matthew 13, Jesus gives us this really short parable. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds can perch in its branches. In a moment, we'll kind of reference where what Jesus is nodding to in terms of another passage here in Matthew 13. But he's speaking of this really small seed that has this sort of explosive nature in terms of how it grows into a large tree. And what's the implications? What is the meaning that Jesus might be attempting to give us in this space? And so we'll play with that here in just a moment. And then there's one other very short parable. And he still had another parable he wanted to speak, and it's like one sentence. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. So this idea of the yeast and the influence that it has on bread. So if I look at these two verses, and I attempt to say, all right, well, how can they reset maybe the hyper-conventional way in which some of us come to the sort of our world and our reality? And if Jesus is saying, well, there's a different reality I'm inviting you into, and if the wording and the language that he uses, it's this idea of a kingdom, a new initiative, a new idea, a new way of being, a new way of engaging other people, a new way of seeing other people, a new way of seeing our reality. That's what Jesus was inviting us into. And so, again, often I think we see it from a really sort of, there's an issue, there's a problem, and then we're going to fix it kind of disposition. But I think Jesus' world, where I'm speculating, although clearly there's a lot of fixing and healing going on, I wonder if the way we think it should be done and the way that maybe we're inviting to engage it are just fundamentally different. So what I want to do here is maybe sort of make the statement or ask the question, I wonder if in a different world, ... I wonder if in a different world something else could be a reality, that maybe my conventional way of seeing it is not the ideal, but there's another way. And so I want to play with that and again, maybe sort of pull out of what Jesus might be inviting us into in some of these sort of cryptic, really earthy parables. So I wonder if in a different world there is more generosity. And I don't mean the kind of generosity where we're writing more checks or giving away more stuff, and that might be part of it. But I wonder if we're sort of engaging a system that fundamentally is more generous. That is, it's not so dammed up. Like I feel at times, and maybe this is your reality, I feel like we have to work really, really hard for things to move forward, for things to happen. It feels like at times that we're doing all this work and we get little return. That the ROI seems to be so difficult at times, whatever that might be. Whether it be the work that we're trying to do here at Watershed, whether it be the idea of trying to change our own lives, whether it's this way of being disciplined in how we engage other people through our kindness, through generosity, whatever it might be. But there feels like there's this tension that is holding us back, that the system is fundamentally not generous. But the kind of kingdom that it seems as though Jesus is inviting us to look at is much more generous. It starts out small and grows into this huge tree. That's a generous infrastructure. That a little bit of yeast, it somehow impacts this huge amount of bread, and it expands in rich and beautiful ways. Again, it's so opposite for how many of us live today, where generosity is not a part of our reality. That maybe we're more critical as opposed to assuming that somebody actually is good. Maybe we're often assuming that they might not love when we should sort of lean towards the sense that, well, maybe they do actually love us, or maybe we should love them, or maybe they are more lovable, or whatever it might be. This sense of being more generous. I wonder if in a different world there's more generosity. I wonder if in a different world we all experience greater freedom. And this is one that we play with a lot here at Watershed, and this is not necessarily a new concept for us, but it seems as though, again, Jesus, I think, sort of in a scandalous and a very provocative way, is introducing that the God figure in one of these passages we were just reading in the leaven yeast bread making experience, the God figure is a woman. Now, I think to most of us, as we conventionally read this passage, we think, well, there's probably a woman in this as the main character in this passage because, well, wouldn't that be illustrative of maybe first century where the woman might be traditionally doing and making some of the meals and some of the bread? Well, then that's possible as well. But I wonder if the kingdom way, the Jesus way, the non-conventional way is saying, actually, this woman is bringing forth this bread. She's creating it. She's making it. That she is the God figure in this passage. And again, that gives it's a very different change to how most people would have understood women in the first century. They were not a position of power and influence. We know that. But Jesus, he was constantly inviting freedom. Freedom for the oppressor and freedom for the oppressed, right? And what does this begin to look like? Because the kingdom is about emancipation, that it's the norm. That when somebody who is oppressing others begins to wake up and realizes that they're oppressing is not actually freeing themselves, but when they cease to oppress, they experience freedom, just like the person they're lording over. I wonder if in a different world we all experience freedom. I wonder if in a different world the weak really are stronger. I mean, this seems to be a statement of how God runs the entirety of the whole universe, right? It's through suffering and weakness and vulnerability that God is present with us, and it is in that space we are saved. This has been true since the beginning of creation, that God seemingly runs the universe on this death-resurrection theme, that this theology of the cross is pervasive in the Old and in the New Testament. That there's some kind of symbolic, oxymoronic superpower at play when we experience brokenness, when we experience pain, when we experience weakness. That somehow, ironically so, pain gives you and I strength. That it is when we are experiencing difficulty that somehow we find strength. I think, for me anyways, the assumption has often been, and again, this is the conventional way of looking at it, that the strength sort of comes in the resurrection, right? That I go through this pain and then I come out of it and now I am strong because I am free from that pain. But actually, I wonder if the strength actually is in the pain, is when you are at your weakest. It is when you are the strongest. About maybe 9 months ago now, it was May, and you've heard this story probably multiple times, but our house had these huge 100-year-old trees in the front yard. We had this crazy storm, and 3 of the trees came smashing down on our house in May. And fortunately, everybody was okay, but we were homeless, and it was not an ideal time to not have our space to be in with COVID and having to move at multiple different times, and it was crazy. And in that time, in vintage Watershed form, tons of you showed up in meals and all the great stuff that you guys typically do when each of us are in need. One of our friends, a friend of our family, is this amazing woman. She is a single mom of 4 children, works crazy hours just to kind of, to keep food on the table and just to keep the basics in her reality. Has very limited amounts of time, does very little for herself, is constantly giving. She's a choir director at her church. She's involved in Wednesday night choir rehearsals and Sunday mornings at her church, and that's her community. That's her relationships. And when the trees pummeled our home, not only did you all show up, but she too showed up. And she doesn't have time, she doesn't have the resources, but invariably she showed up. Why? Because really, maybe in our weakness is when we are the strongest. That we have the most to offer when we don't have anything to offer. Strength is in the dying, maybe, not in the resurrection. That's the kind of kingdom narrative that maybe Jesus is inviting us into. I think if I'm honest, and I imagine this would be true for most of you, this has been a brutal year at every level. There's been hints of respite, maybe. There's been hints of, oh, this is a good season, but fundamentally, it has been a brutal year. And if it could be erased, that would be okay, I think. And maybe that's true for most of us. Maybe that's not. I don't know how it plays out for some of you all. But I know it's been really hard. It's been really hard here at work, right? We are designed to be together. It's the work that we do. It's the work that we started. And at least every Sunday, there's a ton of us that get to connect. And it's been over a year since we've had those experiences. And so it makes the work here different. It makes it hard. It makes it feel at times like we are people out there, even though we get to see you digitally, we get to hear from you, and we know some of you are watching now. It just makes the work really hard. And there are times it feels like giving up would be maybe easier. And maybe it would be easier, but we still know that the work is there's still so much work that needs to be done here. And really love what we get to do. And a few weeks ago, maybe it was 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, I can't remember when it was. I know we talk a lot about petty thieves, but we were at a gathering at Petty Thieves, and it was basically the last sort of graduate class of preface. And we all said, hey, let's get together. The weather was going to be really nice that day, and we were going to be distanced. And so we got together on the sort of porch outside at Petty Thieves, and we're sitting there, and it was a really amazing experience because first of all, everybody showed up from the digital preface to our sort of physical gathering there. It was really good to see a 3D version of these people and to be able to engage and to hear what's going on in their lives, which we heard a little bit, but the dialogue back and forth really was meaningful. And not only was that of consequence, but then behind our group, actually all around us, there were tons of other people who we were recognizing as they were walking into the space, and hey, so-and-so, and good to see you, and began to realize this place is loaded with Watershed people. And the people that were there to meet with us and the people that were there not to meet with us, but just to be with each other, there was this huge amount of chemistry, and it felt so good to be in a space with people that we've taken for granted that this is something that we get to do every week. And in that moment, maybe in the season of, I'm tired, I'm spent, this is hard to do, I'm feeling really weak, it is in that moment that I came away and I said, Matt, this is why we do what we do. I mean, for the first time in a long time, I got to connect with some people that we just haven't seen, and just to be in the presence of other people. It was deeply rich. It was deeply meaningful. That it was in that moment of weakness that maybe I was feeling the strongest. Maybe a different kind of world is when we get to see, when the seating at the table often changes, when it shifts, when it edits. The passage that we were reading earlier references this whole idea of a seed going to a plant, going into a big tree. Well, like I said a moment ago, that's a nod into this passage in Daniel, when in the Old Testament, and Daniel wrote this about a tree, and about, more specifically, this kingdom of God being symbolized as a tree and vast land. And the tree grew great and strong, Daniel 4. Its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the ends of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, its fruit abundant, and it provided food for all. The animals of the field found shade under it, the birds of the air nested in its branches, and from it all living beings were fed. So this idea, this metaphor of tree that Jesus clearly was referencing in Matthew, if you were a good Jewish student of the Torah and the Old Testament, you would have been aware of this Daniel passage, and you would have heard Jesus' words and thought, okay, he's referencing that this large tree is illustrative of this kingdom, is illustrative of this space where the tree provides sustenance. It provides fruit, and animals and creatures are eating from this fruit. It provides a place where the birds are living, and people are being there with each other. There's a sense of community. It's communal. That the kingdom is about sustenance, that the kingdom is about being communal, that the kingdom is about all are welcome at the table, that it's not just a small group of us who get to sort of rally and circle the wagons, that the kingdom is about all. It's about being in that space. That this tree is, that the passage of the tree is so large, this kingdom is so large that it can be seen throughout the entire earth and the entire world. It's not about some sort of pecking order. Well, I wonder, and again, I don't know how this has played out for you, and I know this is so many of your stories as I hear it in preface, but I grew up in the Christian tradition, and some of it was really good for me, in that I understood what it meant to be loved, and I understood what it meant to be valued, and I understood what it meant to be cared for. I was taught that we need to care for others, that we need to give of ourselves. Like, some of these principles were really, really helpful growing up. And then there were other nuances of my tradition that said, if people don't think or see or assume reality like we do, then they're out. And so we spent much of our energy, much of my young adult and older adult energy, before we made some shifts around here, to trying to figure out what it meant to circle the wagons with more and more people that saw the world through the same perspective, the same lens. which obviously is not a kingdom disposition. It's not what Jesus was inviting us into. But it was how I saw reality. Again, it was really practical. It was very definitive. It was who's in, who's out. How do we measure and assess people? It was about a pecking order, even though we would be careful to say it that way. That's how it felt. And I know that's a story for many of you. I know that's how you are seeing and have begun to see reality, that you've come from a space that you were put into a container and you were told that's how you need to see the kingdom or the essence of God in that space. And yet you felt like, no, it's changing and there's something else, there's something more to be had. And you moved into a space maybe here at Watershed where we've begun to ask different questions. We use statements like, well, we hold the tension for you, and we don't have to have all the answers. As a matter of fact, we don't have all the answers. We might find ourselves having more questions than we have answers. And we've begun to sort of pick apart maybe some of the ways that we came from and some of the places we came from, and to engage a new way of being, a new way of seeing reality. And it's been deeply freeing. It's been deeply powerful to be able to do that in community where you begin to watch each other sort of wake up to new understandings, to new realities. And that's been a really rich part of what we get to do here. And at times, and I find myself guilty of this, if we're not careful, if I'm not careful, I find my new awakenings, I find my new realities really being something that begins to circle the wagons. Well, wait a minute, you don't understand the scriptures this way? Well, you know what, the way you're imposing the Bible on me doesn't really fit, and your way might not fit my way, so I don't know if I'm going to be as open to hearing that. I've found myself doing that. Or, wait a minute, you see justice a certain way, different than I see justice, and you know what, your way is not as good, my way is better. And I might not be as blatant that way, but sometimes I find myself feeling that way. Or I'll find some of us having conversations that see the world through a different perspective. We might be critical of those that don't have that same worldview. Maybe my political view is different than your political view, and if I'm not careful, I can be judgmental of that. And maybe, again, not even meaning to do so, but it can lean that way. And so you might feel like somehow you're a second-class citizen, and that is not at all our intent. But I know I've found myself doing that. I know I've probably hurt people in that same way. And here's what was, for me, all these years, in all these different shifts, and we've made so many of them here at Watershed. Even before Watershed, I can look at, there were certain key people that were pillars in my life that helped me understand new sort of, dare I say, evolving doses of reality. And they were gracious enough to bring me along and then let me retract a little bit. And they weren't critical, they weren't oppressive, they weren't telling me that I was wrong. They kind of let me grow into that space so that I could then continue to move forward. And part of having a seat at the table, part of giving the space where we can kind of pull up the chair is saying, all right, maybe we don't all see the world through the same perspective. Maybe some of us sitting at the table will not have a progressive theological worldview. I tend to think that's a really meaningful place to be. I tend to think there's a lot of energy in that. But sometimes not everybody's going to be in that space. And are we offering a seat at the table that says, all right, if you're not there, you're still welcome? Now, we might have some things that we're very passionate about. We might have some worldviews that are very intense for us and that are something that we're holding very tightly towards, right? Like, we got to care for other people. If people are pulling themselves up to that table and they're not generous with who they are, they're not caring, if they're only critical, if they're harsh, if they're attacking, then we might invite them to sort of be pushed back a little bit. And you know, when you're ready to come to the table and ready to listen and to engage and to share and to talk and to engage, then that's different. But I wonder at times, if we're not careful, the progressive narrative can be the new fundamentalism, right? Because somehow we think we've arrived. We understand what we think to be true, and for all intents and purposes is profoundly true. But part of the kingdom, I think, is saying we sit with that with as much humility as we possibly can. And I am guiltiest of this. And this is part of the this different world kind of narrative. What does it mean to be generous towards each other? To be able to pull up to the table and to hold that seat well with others at the table that might not see it like we do. A new kind of world is understanding that it truly feels like an upside-down reality. This is, again, I think Jesus does this in such a powerful way. The idea of yeast or leaven, something kind of the same thing, were used primarily as negative terms or imagery in the first century Palestine. So it would have, when Jesus is talking about the yeast and the bread and somehow it being a good thing, that would have been a relatively new idea or rare concept, because for the most part, yeast was often compared to corruption or sin. Kind of like a little bit of corruption, for example, could quickly contaminate everybody, right? Would be the way it might be used. Or in our modern day way, one rotten apple can spoil the whole barrel, that sort of thing. But perhaps this is not surprising that Jesus would use this sort of imagery. Jesus was never much interested in being sort of pure, right? That wasn't what he was trying to do. As a matter of fact, he was often inviting the unpure into something. Maybe he liked this image of leavened bread or yeast precisely because it was reminiscent of those down and out, like the criminals and the prostitutes, who were the special focus of Jesus' attention and the first recipients of his message. After all, they were unclean. They were wicked. They were not pure, right? And maybe that's exactly what Jesus was trying to say here in his unconventional way, that it actually are those who are on the fringe, those who are perceived as impure, those who are the prostitutes and the criminals and the tax collectors, right? They are the ones that actually are going to push my kingdom forward. That it is the yeast that begins to permeate the bread and for it to grow and to be at its best. And so consider how the yeast works. It disappears into the loaf. It puffs up little pockets of carbon dioxide and permeates the bread and expands it. And the yeast becomes so thoroughly a part of the loaf that it can no longer be detected, yet it completely animates the entirety, the whole. I think for me, I struggle on so many of these different fronts, but one of them is the hope front, right? It feels like BBs in the shoebox sometimes when we're trying to make a difference, trying to make a dent. There's this massive problem. There's just a few of us, and again, it also implies that somehow we've got all the answers. But if we're trying to bring wholeness, if we're trying to bring the kingdom forward, if we're trying to initiate this sort of counterintuitive way of seeing reality, if we're looking at all the difficulties and all the problems that we feel like from a justice perspective we should be jumping into, right? Maybe it's education, or it's feeding people, or anti-racism, whatever the work is. It seems so daunting, it seems so big. And yet the metaphor of the kingdom is it's the small evolving into the big, right? It's a little bit of yeast that somehow permeates and makes this huge dent. You might not be able to actually see the yeast, but you see its influence, you see its impact. That Watershed, we might be small. But that's exactly the imagery. That's exactly what the kingdom uses. That's exactly how it's powered, right? It's powered by the small mustard seed, the incidental, the almost virtually unknown. And in that, it begins to grow. It begins to permeate. It begins to make its mark. And possibly it's even hard to quantify and measure to a conventional person like myself. It's often so hard to assess, so hard to see its value. Because if you can't see it, then you can't quantify it. And if you can't quantify it, then it's hard to measure, and there's no value to it. But in the sense of kingdom, in this world that maybe Jesus is inviting us to see, in a different kind of world, it's the small that makes the greatest dent. It's a little bit of yeast that makes the greatest mark. You look at the life of Jesus, and I don't know what was happening in the strategy rooms when he would sit there and try to think about what his new kingdom would look like, but it seemed like he was engaging a different kind of reality in a different way. And he's invited us into that reality. And so, yes, we're small. And yes, it feels daunting. But maybe there is hope. Maybe a different world is really an option. And maybe we can really make our impact the greatest when we begin to see it from an unconventional way, when we begin to back down and say, all right, there's a different way in which we go after this. And so then the question becomes, all right, God, give us wisdom, right? Give us this way of understanding. And so I pray, Father, that you do give us that way of understanding, that you give us a way that is counterintuitive to how we see reality, that we come after it with a sense of humility, with a sense of grace, with a sense of this desire to be something that not like we're trying to just please you, but we want to change the world, right? That we want to be a part of we want to at least be one of the agents that somehow brings this shift going forward. That we here at Watershed, that we get to look at our city, that we get to understand justice, that we get to understand that this kingdom is about not only doing things well in community, not only involving and bringing people around us, but in the end, really loving well, really caring for people well. That when we are at our weakest, that is when we are our strongest. And so, Father, infuse us, empower us to impact others, empower us to serve well. And we thank you for the work that we get to do. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.